With that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Charles Giancarlo is Managing Director of Silver Lake, one of the leading private investment companies in the technology sector. And before that, he was Executive Vice President at Cisco. And also, he was the president of the Linksys division at Cisco. He started at Cisco as Vice President of Business Development, and he developed and executed the the mergers and acquisition strategy of Cisco. And before that, Charles founded no less than 4 companies. He also, in 2008, was the interim CEO of Avaya, and he is still the chairman of Avaya's board of directors. He also serves on the board of directors of Gerson Lerman Group, as well as Accenture and Netflix. Charles earned his Bachelor's of Science from Brown University in Electrical Engineering and his Master's of Science here at Berkeley, and he also has an MBA from Harvard. With that, please welcome Charles Giancarlo.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I want to thank BT and ICLAC for inviting me here today, and for the Citrus Center in general for being so hospitable. And also want to congratulate the Venture Lab winners that I understand just got selected today. So congratulations to you. I've been asked to speak about 2 topics. One is one of my favorite topics, and the other one is one of my least favorite topics. So my favorite topic is to talk a little bit about where I think that some of the technology, some of the opportunities in the future are going to be for new companies in the technology space. And one of my least favorite topics, I've been asked to speak about myself a little bit. So and I've been asked to start with that. So I'm going to start with my least favorite topic first. You heard a little bit about how I started. I'm an electrical engineer, like many of you in the audience. Got my master's here at Berkeley, for which I'm very grateful. It was a fabulous experience for me. Got me started in semiconductors, which is my background. Started out, I got my master's in development of mixed signal CMOS devices in ancient times. In fact, I cut rubylith, which no one, I think, in the room knows what rubylith is. That's when you use cameras to make semiconductors. And then afterwards, I went to work in Germany for Siemens, actually, when Siemens had semiconductors. It's now called Infineon, which was a great experience. It was a European experience. But oddly enough, something that I didn't expect, it turned into a very big management experience for me. And I learned my first lesson about how important management of technology was. Because as I was studying and working on a new chip that we were going to make that was for a telecommunications system, it was a codec filter. It coded voice into digital signals. I figured out that the design that they were working on wasn't going to work. Just simply wasn't going to work. But the management insisted that, well, that didn't really matter. We're still going to build this chip because that's what we've decided to do. It was rather German, I have to say. And I said, well, that's silly, of course. Why would we work on a chip that we know is not going to work? And oddly enough, I had to battle. I had to fight this battle, which resulted in a manager being changed, and a variety of different things happened. But the successful outcome occurred, which is we produced a new design that was successful and actually turned into over a decade of success for that company. But I figured out very quickly that it wasn't just enough to be an engineer doing your job as you're told. At times, you need to step up and take charge when you know things are going in the wrong direction. Now, I do think that it's extremely important for you to, and one thing I will say, and that's an example of it, that life in many ways is a bit of a walk in the woods, meaning that you just never know what's going to hit you from around the corner. All sorts of unexpected events, both failures and opportunities. And it could be completely random for you unless you have some type of compass. And your compass is what it is that you fundamentally in your gut want to achieve. It's the things that you fundamentally believe in, and it's the things that you're willing, it's the amount of time and effort that you're willing to put into something, and what you're willing to sacrifice along the way. And I think that that becomes a very important, that becomes your guideposts as you go through life. And for me, right from the time when I was at Berkeley, what I wanted to do was I wanted to produce useful products. I wanted to have an impact. And frankly, and the people who knew me here at the time knew that I wanted to start a company and build a company. And that's sort of what guided me along the way, in spite of the fact that I had many failures along the way. And one guided the very next step in my life, and that was that with a colleague at Berkeley, Jim Rosenberg, we had developed together this great new technology that we felt was something that was going to be very important for the world. And what it was an especially efficient motor controller. It turns out that a large portion of the electricity grid is used for running motors. And if you can run them more efficiently, you could not only save power, but in this case, you could actually, in the case of the invention we made, you could save generation capacity. And so we thought it was fabulous. And it was the proverbial thing where we worked in my mother's garage for like 9 months. And we had that eureka moment where it was working. We actually got it to work. And we could prove it. We have all the waveforms. And it was fabulous. And these are two graduates, master's degrees out of Berkeley, 25 years ago. And we have that eureka moment. And then we look at each other and say, oh, no, now what? And we did not have a clue as to how we were going to build a company or make this thing successful. And it was really sort of at that point, a little bit later, where I decided to go to business school, because I decided that I actually needed to have some education in business in order for me to be able to achieve what I wanted to achieve. Now, the world was a little bit different back then. When we went through engineering school back then, there wasn't the kind of focus there is today on entrepreneurship, on building the kinds of skills that you're getting today and in the programs that you're seeing around how to start companies. Silicon Valley, it had the name, but it was still largely in its infancy. So I went to business school, as you heard, and I was pretty much the only high-tech guy at Harvard Business School at the time. But I was arrogant enough when I came out to try and start a company right away. We started a company in the area of ATM and Sonnet, which were some of the new communications technologies at the time, looking for capital. First mistake was I started it on the East Coast, where I was from, New Jersey. So I was working with East Coast venture capitalists. I know that's an oxymoron, but that's what I was doing. And the second mistake was I wasn't very careful with respect to selection of management. That I had gotten involved with a number of people who were good people overall, but not long-term experienced hands in starting companies. And between that and the crash in the stock market in 1987, had my first failure. I'd spent about 1.5 years, basically on low salary, skimping, living off my wife. And it was a real blow in 1987. But what was important was I had learned a lot. And this goes to a second thing that I fundamentally believe is don't let any failure go to waste. You learn a lot more in a failure than you do from any success. And you learn the hallmarks and you learn the warning signs of failure before it starts to happen. So really, as you go through life, and even when you have successes, you have small failures along the way, make sure you really internalize those failures, learn the lessons of them so that you don't make the same mistake twice. I think that's extremely important advice. So after that, not to be deterred, I joined a company in the Valley, came out to California, joined a company in the Valley, and soon after that spun out another company, which was again ATM and Sonnet focused. And this one was a reasonable success. I learned a lot along the way, sold it back to the original company, and then found myself out of a job because I didn't care to go back to the original company. But by that time, I had learned a lot about the telecommunications market, about what can be successful, and more importantly than anything else, I think, is I learned over that period of time the way the world really worked. rather than the way I imagined it to work. And I think that's, let's say, a third lesson as you go down the path in business, is we all start out in the world with certain, I think, fantasies. I think it's rare for people coming right out of school to start with a really clear-eyed, realistic view of the way the world really works. And in fact, that would be quite, I think that would be quite unusual for anyone to be able to start out like that. Instead, we start out with a perception of how it could work or should work. And in fact, I think that's one of most of our pitfalls is we say, well, it should work this way. And therefore, we keep on trying to see it as if it does work that way. And in fact, the world works according the way you learn over time the way the world really works. And in some cases, that's cynical. In other cases, it's just very realistic and very Darwinistic. But you really need to understand the way it works. You have to learn the way the world really works. And then, once you know how it works, then you can try to change the way the world works. But you can't change the way the world works until you know how it works today. So one of the things I figured out along the way was that Ethernet was going to win. It didn't really matter what the future was what the future standard was. Whatever it was going to be called Ethernet. And so I started with a company that had its trouble, had downsized because it couldn't build its product, and had gone from 80 people down to 8, called Kalpana. And a friend of mine who had invested in it asked me to help, and I jumped in. And lo and behold, we figured out that we could really make this successful. And this was the company that invented the Ethernet switch, and which is eventually how I made my way to Cisco, because about 2 years after I joined, we had gone from literally 0 to a run rate of about $60 million a year. As I tell people, at one point in time, I had 100% of the Ethernet switch market, and then I fought for 15 years to try and get that back again. But Cisco bought us in 1994. And again, it was a very mediocre acquisition. I thought actually that I was going to leave. And by mediocre acquisition, what I mean to say is that Cisco bought it, but of course you have people already inside the company who want to be on top, want to be leaders, and so forth. And what they did was they really suppressed the management and the employees of the acquired company. And this was actually rather typical, because at that point in time, in the early, this was the early 90s, and the 20 years prior to that, mergers and acquisitions, any acquisition in the high-tech space always met with failure. All the employees left, they went on to start another company, and the valley was ripe with companies that had been started from the departed executives and engineers from companies that had been acquired. And at the time, John Chambers, who's CEO of Cisco, came to me and said, well, I'd like you to start and build a business development organization within Cisco. And I said, why would I want to do that? Everybody knows that M&A doesn't work in high tech. And he said, well, why don't you try to find a way to make it work? And that was interesting. It appealed to one of my great weaknesses, which is a challenge. I hate people giving me a challenge because usually it means that I'm going to take it, in spite of the fact that it's probably not good for me. So I took it on, in spite of the fact that up until that time I had been sort of an engineer, an engineering manager, somebody very very involved in the operations of a business, and this is clearly more of a staff job. But to be honest with you, Cisco stock was doubling every year. It was a good place to be. I was a little bit tired from all of the startups, so it was a good place to I thought, rest for a while, albeit it turned out that it never got to be a rest. And so we took that on, and with the idea being, and this may sound odd to you, but for the most part, M&A is run by deal people, financial people. And what they will do is they'll identify a company that at a, quote, strategic level makes a lot of sense for another company to buy. In other words, it has a complementary product, or it has a strong development team, or it's part of a new marketplace that the other company wants to get into. So they say, strategically, it makes a lot of sense. Let's go buy it. They buy it, and then they say, okay, we won, it's done. And then no more work. In many cases, very little work then goes into making it successful. And my view, especially having been acquired twice, and in both times where the acquisition was not really very pleasant, I looked at it from the other point of view, which is that, well, if you're going to buy something, it doesn't really, any idiot with a checkbook can buy something. The whole point is not buying it. The whole point is making it successful, first of all. And in a high-tech business where products change every year and where your product 2 years from now is going to be different than the product today, the important assets are the ones that walk out of the door every night. And so the first thing you need to do is make sure that the employees that you're acquiring feel completely empowered to continue building great products. And the great thing about Cisco was it had a fabulous sales force. They were like, ravenous meat eaters, and any new product was like a piece of red meat that you'd hold out to them, and they'd grab that and start selling it. So our strategy became really clear, which is, we were focused on building out the internet, building out IP, and so any product that was synergistic with that or that helped us to expand the reach of IP and that had a good development team was something that we were interested in. But then what we really focused on was the proper integration of that team. We empowered them, we set them up as a separate unit, we allowed them to define the products that they were going to build and the strategy that they were going to follow going forward. And then we integrated them in with the sales force. And it turned out to be a very, very successful strategy for us for many, many years. And I have to say, it was a lot of fun to build. But after a couple of years, and I'll try to end this pretty soon, after a couple of years, I wanted to get back into operations and start building products again. So I was lucky enough to be given an opportunity to do that again at Cisco. And I took over what they called their new commercial group, which was the group selling to small, medium business. We did that for a few years. During that period of time, we started IP telephony, so the migration of voice from TDM systems to IP. We started that in 1997 and on transport, and then 1998 in terms of PBX or telephone systems. We started our wireless Wi-Fi activities in 1999. I remember presenting it. I would drive my wife crazy because I had all this stuff around the house where I was the first person basically using wireless in the home, and people thought I was crazy for saying that people are going to go around the house using wireless on their laptops. But obviously it was something that over time became very, very successful. And then we hit the and we built the commercial business up to about a third of Cisco's revenues at the time, so about $8 billion. Then in 2001, we had the historic market crash, which many of you were very young at the time, but it was the nuclear winter of the high-tech industry. Just to give you a sample of that, at the time, Cisco was growing 15% per quarter, about 70% a year. Okay, so in the October quarter of 2000, we had just grown 15%, or annual run rate of over 70, and it was just continuing at that rate. We were about $25 billion at the time, and we had a market cap of about $400 billion. $400 billion. And by April of the next year, so less than 6 months later, the stock price was at that time, about 65. 6 months later, the stock price was about 15. The market cap was down around $80 billion. Sales had dropped by 40%. So we were increasing at 15% per quarter and dropped by 40% in 2 quarters. I mean, it was just devastating. And of course, whole companies just completely went out of business at that time. And as you might imagine, a lot of the businesses that we had started that looked great just 6 months earlier looked absolutely ridiculous and absurd at that time. So as you might imagine, there was a big shakeup at the company, and I volunteered for and got all the bad businesses. And the reason why I volunteered for it was, to be very honest with you, I didn't trust anybody else with the bad businesses. I knew that they really had to be dealt with. And dealt with meant, in some cases, shut down. In other cases, dramatically downsized. In other cases, just a complete change in direction. I cared a lot about the company, and I knew that the parts of the company that could be successful were going to do well, but the parts that what would hurt the company are the parts of the company that were doing badly, and so I took that on. We did a number of other things during that time. We started our entry into the consumer side of the business with Linksys, an acquisition of Linksys, which was great fun. And we could take up a lot of time on that, but the Linksys consumer business was growing at just incredible rates, and the retail business was a completely different side of things. But more importantly was what you had to do when times were not good. So a lot of what you're studying right now is how do you build a company from scratch, and that's a great skill set. And building companies is something that's very good. And this is another lesson I learned that's serving me well now is, at some point in time, especially later on in your career, you have to do other things as well. And there are other ways of helping society. And right now, we see this across our economy. There are a lot of businesses that had grown large, but are no longer well run, right? Or they have other problems. And fixing businesses that are in trouble is also something that's extremely important. And those were things that I was able to learn during that period of about 2001 to 2003. And the other thing I learned is you work really hard when things are going up, and you work really hard when things are going down. So there's no way to get out of that. And so finally I just said, well, if I'm going to work hard on the way up and work hard on the way down, you've got to pace yourself in your life. And that's something you learn that I think is extremely important as well, is in life, you do need to pace yourself. You can't always be running all out. You got to take time. As one board member told me one day, actually, this is a funny story. He said, "Charlie, you look terrible." And this was a fellow, he was about 65, 70 years of age, in very good shape. And he was the CEO of a Fortune 100 company. And he said, "Look, Charlie," he goes, "if you keel over and die, you're not going to be helping anyone. Not the company, certainly not your family. So you got to take better care of yourself." And I think that's generally true. Is you got to make sure that you take care of yourself. So let me just try to close this chapter on my life. As BT mentioned, I got to the point where I was running all of development and all of the products, all the divisions within Cisco, which was great fun. When I got that job, it took me about 30 days to realize that I had been promoted from engineer to sociologist. It was no longer a case where you could go to people and tell them exactly what to do. Now, first of all, there were way too many people to be able to do that with. But secondly, you were then managing people who had their own opinions about things and who were very strong. And what I realized is that my job really was about creating an environment where people did the right things, where people knew what the right thing to do was and were able to do that and decide that on their own. And also an environment that people were excited about, were enthusiastic about, wanted to stay, where they felt that it was the right place for them on a long-term basis, and most importantly, where they felt like they'd be rewarded for the right type of behavior. So in spite of the fact that OB, or organizational behavior, was the only course I flunked during business school, I'd learned that actually it's probably one of the most important things as you start to build larger and larger companies, because at some point in your life, you get to the point where it's not what you do, it's what your team does underneath you that determines success or failure. So let me just mention a few things about Silver Lake. So I left Cisco. For me, it just was the right time to leave at the end of 2007. And I joined Silver Lake Partners. Now, a big reason why I joined them, frankly, was that I had quite a few friends there who I enjoy working with. So, the partnership, the camaraderie is very important to me. Part of it was that I really did feel, what a private equity group does, let me just explain that for a moment. Private equity is a little bit different than venture capital. They're both investors, but if venture capital is about the birth of companies, private equity is about the rebirth of companies. We buy companies there are reasons why we get to buy the companies we get to buy. Usually they're down on their luck, their industry's in trouble, They've had poor management. They're not operating well, and therefore they're affordable for us to buy. But most importantly, we buy companies that we think have either they're in a great market, have the ability to be restructured, have the ability to be improved, and have the ability over time to be successful again. And so we buy companies, we invest in them. Sometimes we buy several companies, put them together. Sometimes we buy divisions out of larger companies and spin them out and have them be standalone companies. But one way or another, our focus is on improving the operations of companies. And we only focus on high tech. Silver Lake only focuses on high tech in the private equity market. And that's been, I've enjoyed it quite a bit, as BT mentioned. In spite of the fact that this was not a feature of joining, I took over one of their portfolio companies on a temporary basis called Avaya. It's an interesting case study because it was the worst operating company I'd ever seen up until that point. I called it, and I said this right in front of their employees, that it was a museum of discredited business practices. It was one of the spin-outs from AT&T and Lucent. And I felt like I had gone from teaching graduate school at Cisco, where we were innovating on the forefront of business, to teaching kindergarten in terms of just getting down to basics of business. How do you run a supply chain? How do you run a sales planning process? How do you run, just a business meeting? I mean, really very, very basic stuff. But it turns out that when it's that basic, and they had fundamentally a very good business, you can affect a turnaround relatively quickly. And we've doubled the profitability in a year of that company, now to the point where they're buying the division of Nortel that's in a similar business. And I think we're going to be making them very, very successful over time. And then the final thing I'll just mention at Silver Lake, because I think it might be of interest, is we just recently announced our intent, and this should close in the next 4 to 6 weeks, our intent to buy Skype, again, a spin-out from eBay, and something that we think that it's sort of been a withering flower within eBay. And once we're able to take it out and run it separately as a focused business, that we're going to be able to allow it to grow and get into new business areas, very, very successfully. So that's going to be, we think, a lot of fun. So let me stop there. Let me talk a little bit about where I see technology going, because as you might imagine, at Cisco, we were constantly in the process of developing new markets and new technology, and that was something that I think the entire company and certainly I enjoyed very much as we went through. And you'll notice right away that I'm more of a hardware guy than a software guy, so my opinions may be a bit biased in that direction. But one of the ones that we're very excited about, I'm personally very excited about, is video. And I know that sounds like a very broad topic, but it is a very broad topic, and I'm excited about many different aspects of it. IPTV, or the delivery of video over the internet, over IP to homes and portable devices and mobile devices, I think is going to continue to expand in the future. And despite YouTube, so YouTube's been done, but there are many, many more opportunities in that space. One of the last things we created at Cisco before I left was telepresence, which was great fun. And if you haven't seen it yet, it's really quite remarkable. You can go into like any kind of small meeting room and have a meeting with people that are across the other side of the world, and it feels like they're in the same room with you. And I mean, it really feels like they're in the same room with you. And you can have hours and hours of meetings and not get tired as you can in a normal video conference. And I believe that's going to be going to the home. Your children will be meeting with grandma, I guarantee it, through telepresence in your home. So video on that side, video in terms of delivery, across the world in terms of IPTV, and even personal, being able to be your own broadcaster out of your home to huge populations. That's going to be there as well. So video is, I think, a very exciting space. Another very exciting space is software as a service. And it's not just about reducing costs. Instead of operating the servers yourself or operating and buying the software and operating that yourself, having it be off-site. It's not just about that. what it's really about is creating whole new ecosystems of partners that are able to share the same database, the same information in a confidential way. Because today, as you might know, within companies are largely horizontally structured, meaning that, for example, Cisco, just to use an example I know very well, makes equipment, but really what we do is we design equipment. It's made by manufacturers in China, third parties. It's sold by distributors and resellers who are separate parties, people like IBM and HP. And it's sold to end user customers. We buy chips from other manufacturers. We buy other components from other manufacturers. So as you see, we have our place in an overall value chain. And the communication between Cisco and other layers in that value chain is through very thin information pipes. Within a company, within Cisco, within our suppliers, everything's wired. You know, every penny that's spent goes into an SAP or Oracle information system, and you're able to analyze this information to create huge efficiencies within your own organization. But across a supply and delivery chain, you have very thin information pipes, meaning that there's a lot of inefficiencies between the ultimate source of a product, sand, and between the ultimate sale of the product to a user. And those SaaS can really improve those, because instead of tiny little pipes of information between these horizontal layers, SaaS can create marketplaces and share information between these layers. And because it can create greater efficiencies in the marketplace, it's going to be very successful over time. But like any new software construct, it's going to take a decade or more to really play itself out. So SaaS is very exciting. Another one is virtualization. And I know that's a big topic everywhere. And in spite of VMware and Zen and so forth, it's still very much in its infancy. Servers, for the most part, in data centers are still defined by, you know, a metal box, you know, with a set of processors in it and an operating system that is largely confined to that metal box. And if you think about it, why should that be the case? Why shouldn't the operating system really comprise the entire data center? Every processor, every virtual processor in the entire data center, why shouldn't the memory access be all of the memory resident on all of the cards and all of the disks that exist inside that data center? It really should. So virtualization really needs to grow up now, not just be the division of one hardware processor into multiple virtual processors, but actually the union of many hardware processors into one or more virtual processors. And that's a huge computer science problem that has only been started right now. And so there's a lot of opportunity there as well. I'm very excited about, in the enterprise space, about unified communications, meaning collaboration tools to make it much easier for distributed work groups to be able to work together, record what they're doing, be able to analyze it, to remove a lot of the paperwork and the bookkeeping around managing projects between interactions between people. And I think we're going to see a lot of innovation around that space over the next several years. I'm still very excited about the consumer space, although I will say that the consumer space is probably one of the most difficult areas in which to start or run a company. And it's because consumers are very fad-oriented, not loyal, and will quickly migrate from one device or one software program to another. And so, and you can be a hit 1 year and absolutely a dog the next year if you don't follow up a hit with yet another hit. So it's a very exhausting business, and one that really requires a lot of staying power. So I think let me just stop there for a while, and we're going to leave the rest of the time for questions and answers, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have. Yes.
Yeah. So do you have any advice on dealing, like, say that you came upon like a small company that had been around for a while, kind of had a lot of political issues within the management, maybe a lot of old practices. What suggestions would you have on maybe bringing that up and making it better?
Better. Well, I mean, I think, I had, the thing I just did with Avaya was very, very similar to that, right? There are several things that generally are going on when you have any kind of turnaround situation. One is that what you generally find in companies that are failing is that it's not usually just one person, let's say just the president or the CEO. But usually you have some degree of dysfunction throughout the entire management team. I think the first thing you need to do is define a strategy and define a set of goals that are clearly communicated throughout the entire company. That is extremely important. A lot of times, what you find in these companies is that they don't have single goals. There are different groups within the company that have different and divergent goals. Some of those goals, by the way, are completely non-productive. They may be political in nature. Gee, I think I will get ahead, if I try to make this project in the other group fail. And that's a sign of real dysfunction inside of companies. So the first thing you need to do is absolutely define a common set of goals based around business principles, like growing sales, coming out with a new product, delivering better customer service, but being really focused on the end result, being really focused on the customer. The second thing then is you really do need to analyze the management dynamic that's going on between all these different players. There is a very clear rule, which is you cannot change culture in a company or anywhere without changing people. And it's unfortunately true, but I think it's easy to understand. And that is that even if you have good people in a dysfunctional environment, the social pressure around them to continue operating the same way they operated yesterday is so strong that it's even difficult for good people to behave differently. So until you actually change some people out, either people don't believe that things are going to change, or there's so much social pressure for them to continue to conform, they're not going to change. So you have to change people. You have to clearly communicate what good behavior looks like. You have to clearly communicate a focus on the customer. And then you need to change the dynamic. Sometimes changing the dynamic is just reorganizing the company. Sometimes because it needs to be reorganized, sometimes just to change the players so no one is in their comfort zone and you break up whatever political loyalties might exist among those players. But you do have to change the dynamic extensively. A third thing is, and I'm a very strong believer in what I call operational excellence. And what I mean by that is every function in the company. Now, of course, it could be development, or it could be sales and manufacturing, where you want to manufacture at very low cost, right? But frankly, it's also the HR function. How well is that operating? It could be the finance function. How efficient are they? How good is the reports that they give to the managers who need those reports to run their business, right? Every function in the company should be operating at an excellent level compared to best in class. Best in class may be a competitor, or best in class could be somebody in a completely different business. And you can get those numbers. And in fact, something you have your teams do is have them go search who does it best in class, and then how do they do it, and what are the lessons from that. And then you set a goal for them to reach that level. So I'll tell a small anecdote. Again, it was Avaya, and they were running their service organization at 38% gross margin, meaning that if they sold $1 of service, it cost them 62 cents to deliver that service, right? Now, I happen to know, because I had been in that business with Cisco, that best in class was well in the 60s. In fact, in the 70s for that, right? And I knew a lot about what they were doing wrong, but I couldn't fix it myself with a lot of different people. So we talked about it. We changed the person who was in charge, and they were running at 38. And we said, well, gee, to get to best in class, we have to be over 60 to get to best in class. Now, how much time do we want to take to get over 60? Their plan was to improve their performance by 2% that year, so to go from 38 to 40. That was their plan. And I thought, gee, if you need to get to best in class and you give them like 5 years to do it, well, they're not going to do anything differently, right? I thought 2 years was a fair amount of time. So that meant that in order to get to 60, over 60 in 2 years, they had to get to 50 in 1 year. So that was the plan. They had to get to 50 in 1 year. And someone, one level, not the person in charge of service, but one level down from them, in a meeting that they had, called me completely irresponsible because I'd break the company by doing it. Well, a lot of things happened, but 1 year later, the gross margin was 51%, and on its way to 60%. So setting the right goals and challenging people. Everybody wants to achieve. And my old boss used to say, never insult a good team by giving them goals that are too low. So you really want to challenge a team with strong goals. Yes?
During your part of the conversation, you said that when you're young, you have certain imaginations of how the world should be. But when you go out to the real world, you realize the world doesn't work the way you imagine it to be. What are some of the incidents that change your view with this statement?
Well, one of my views, and I agree this was very naive when I got out of school, was, I sort of believed the old saying, build a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door. And the fact of the matter is that you can build a better mousetrap, but there are all sorts of reasons why that could fail. And it could fail because you have a relatively weak management team. It could fail because you don't have the right financial backing from people that can stick with you through all the different phases of needing to raise capital. It could fail because the cost of change for a customer to change from what they're currently doing to using your product may just be too high. It could fail because you don't have a strong marketing campaign, or it's too expensive to get to the set of customers that you need to with the information that they would need to make a different decision. So really understanding, and so again, it shows you a little bit of my bias, which is thinking through all the possible cases of failure so that you can either eliminate those as possibilities, or you can put in place plans and mechanisms and strategies for dealing with those, is an extremely important part of business planning. And I do think that I have to say, I love being with Cisco. I thought I think it remains one of the best companies at execution in the business. And I can tell you, and this is an interesting comparison. At Cisco, we'd spend about 10% of the time talking about what we did well or our successes, and 90% of the time about how bad we were and how we were failing and what our problems were. 90% of the time on the things that were hard. At Avaya, by contrast, they talked 90% of the time about how great they were doing. And I think that's a lesson, right? Business, I think another common misperception, especially when you go to businesses. And if you believe the PR of businesses, right, all these businesses are great at what they do, and they operate great companies. And the fact of the matter is that all companies are broken at one level or another. And most of what you'll do in business and engineering is fix things constantly. You're constantly fixing problems that are in the business. And if you're not fixing problems, they're just piling up. I mean, a business is like any other piece of machinery that just gets old and gets worn over time and starts to break down. And your role as a manager is to identify those things before they break and start fixing them before they start to become real problems. And I think one of the fantasies you have when going into a business is that, no, the way things should be is things should be operating smoothly. And the fact of the matter is you wake up one day realizing that, no, everything's always broken all the time, and your job is just to make sure it doesn't run off the tracks and fix it. You want to get it to be a really good operation, but you can only do that by constantly fixing things. So those are just a couple examples. Yes?
I was very interested by your comment on the consumer space.
Yeah.
It was an area where there wasn't a lot of things like that. In some ways, a lot of products can be seen as either hitting into the consumer space or into the
Yep.
business space. For example, like Ethernet, you could think of it as lots of people are going to use it to access it.
Yep. Yes.
Or you could think of it more in the business. And can you talk about what it means to focus on the business space to move away from the consumer space?
Absolutely. I think you hit upon two of the things that are, or one of the things that is a very strong rule in in at least commerce and at least in the US, right? And that is a successful business either starts and becomes successful either in the consumer space or in the business space, the enterprise space. There's actually also the service provider area, and then migrates to the other one. But what you find when you look at these companies is their real strength is in one space or another. And I think a great example of this is Apple and Microsoft, okay? Microsoft is really strong in the enterprise space. And because of that strength, it's kind of found its way down into the consumer space. But I don't think anybody would call Microsoft a great consumer company, right? Apple, on the other hand, is a great consumer company. You know, and because of that, they find their way into the business space. But they don't focus on the business space at all, right? In fact, if you go into CIOs, generally they don't care for Apple because Apple doesn't cater to their desires. And it's almost impossible to find a company that's good at both. Now you might say, now why is that? And the fact is that the business processes, and this is at the end of the day the thing that limits any company, the business processes that you need, that you operate by to be successful in the business space are just different than what you need to be successful in the consumer space. Let me give you one example. In the business space, if there's a bug in your software and a customer calls and says, your software has this bug and it's keeping me from closing my books, you send engineers out there and you put a patch in place within 24 hours and you get that customer back up again. If you don't, over time, you're going to go out of business, right? The consumer space, consumer calls, says, I have this bug and it's keeping me from making my appointment tomorrow. Who do you call? I mean, they don't even answer the phone, right? Maybe it'll get logged down and maybe, you know, a year from now in, you know, Leopard, you know, 12, you know, maybe it'll get fixed and maybe not, right? I mean, it's just entirely different. In one case, you really listen to your customers. You know, in the other case, you don't. You look at market trends. You look at where things are going. It's much more general trends. One case is very marketing oriented, you know, creating buzz and hype and commercials. In the other case, it's about sales. And what sales means is not like used car sales. Sales, in an enterprise sense, are people who are generally technically trained. They help the customer to define the problem, to understand what the solution's got to be, to integrate the solution into their environment, right? I mean, it's a lot of hands-on, direct work. And it turns out that SMB is sort of in the middle. And SMB is expensive to sell to, and therefore is not a market in and of itself. It's either enterprise down. In other words, they either take enterprise products that have been designed for big companies, and then they use them, or they are consumer up. They take products that have been designed for the consumer and use it in small business. So I think that's it's a very good point, and it's either one or the other, and I've never seen a company be good in both. Yeah.
Whatever happens to those electric motor controllers?
Well, it turns out that the motor control companies eventually got it themselves. Maybe 5 or 6 years later. But after I'd gone to business school, we kind of lost track of it, and we went off in other directions. But basically, what they was 3-phase frequency converters for power, right? So and they did both frequency conversion as well as phase change. So you could make an inductive load look like a resistive load, and do it much more efficiently than by going to a DC motor, right? Especially if you wanted variable speed. So, but eventually the motor control companies figured it out for themselves. So, thanks for asking. Thank you very much. Sorry to bore you for the whole hour.